Am I the jerk for telling my wife I'm not giving up our dog because she's pregnant? My wife and I are expecting our first child in a few months. We've been together for a couple of years, and when we met, I already had my dog, Lettuce, whom I adopted when he was a puppy. He's now 9 years old and has been my best friend through everything. Lately, my wife has been pressuring me to get rid of Lettuce before the baby is born. She says she's worried about allergies, germs around a newborn. Lettuce has never been aggressive, never bitten anyone, and in fact, he's terrified of loud noises, so he'll probably just hide from the baby. I suggested training or additional precautions, but she says she simply doesn't want to take the risk. I stood my ground and said that Lettuce is not going anywhere. Now she's acting as if I'm choosing the dog over her and our baby. I told her that if it were a sudden allergy or a real danger, we would deal with it, but it seems like she just doesn't like him anymore. Now her family is calling me controlling and immature, saying that I need to prioritize my child. But Lettuce is also family, and I refuse to get rid of him just because my wife changed her mind. The arguments have been constant at home. The tension is present at every meal, in every conversation. Sometimes my wife locks herself in our room and doesn't speak to me for hours. Other times she cries, saying she feels like I'm not supporting her in her role as a mother. I try to make her understand that it's not a competition, that I love our future child as much as she does, but I also have responsibilities to a being who has been with me for almost a decade. One night, after a heated argument, she left for her parents' house. She told me she needed time to think, and that maybe I should too. I felt devastated, but I stayed home with Lettuce, feeling guilty, feeling misunderstood. I tried calling her, but she left me on read. Her mother texted me, saying it would be best if I forgot about the dog and thought about my real family, as if Lettuce wasn't part of it. Days later, when she finally came back, she seemed calmer but distant. She told me she had been researching coexisting with dogs and newborns, and that, although she was still not convinced, she was willing to try under certain conditions. She asked me to limit Lettuce's access to some areas of the house, especially the baby's room, and to take him to a vet checkup to make sure he posed no risk to the baby. Even though it felt extreme to me, I agreed. I preferred that over losing her. Weeks passed, and Lettuce seemed to feel the change in the atmosphere. He no longer slept in our room, and at night, he curled up alone on the couch, watching me with those eyes full of loyalty. It broke my heart. I took him for more walks, tried to make it up to him by spending more time together, but the weight of the situation was undeniable. The day my wife went into labor was chaotic. In the rush to get her to the hospital, I forgot to properly close the front door. When I returned home that night to grab a few things, Lettuce was gone. I searched the whole house, called his name around the neighborhood, checked his favorite spots. Nothing. Panic took over me. What if someone had taken him? What if he had wandered into the street and something had happened? That night, I didn't sleep. I made posters, posted on social media. All I could think about was him, how he must have felt stepping out and not finding us. I hated myself for neglecting something as simple as closing the door. 2 days later, while I was still desperately searching, I received a message from a stranger. He had seen a dog that looked like Lettuce in a park a few blocks away. I ran there, and sure enough, there he was, curled up under a bench, dirty and scared. When he saw me, he rushed towards me, wagging his tail desperately. I hugged him tightly, tears in my eyes. When we returned home, my wife was already there with our baby. She looked at me in silence as I cleaned and fed Lettuce. She didn't say anything about it, but in her eyes, I saw something different. Maybe, for the first time, she understood how much he meant to me. But even though Lettuce was back, something had changed. And not just in my relationship with my wife, but in the dynamics of our home. A sense of uncertainty settled between us, like a shadow growing longer with each passing day. Since Lettuce's return, the dynamic at home had changed drastically. My wife barely spoke about the matter, and although she didn't oppose the dog being back in the house, she showed no interest in him either. She spent most of her time focused on the baby, which was understandable, but the distance between us was becoming more evident. The nights were long and exhausting. Our son woke up crying every couple of hours, and Lettuce, still used to our old routines, would stay outside our bedroom as if he felt he was no longer allowed in. It pained me to see him like that, but every time I tried to talk to my wife about it, she would change the subject or sigh in frustration. "We have a baby to take care of. We can't worry about a dog right now," she would say with a mix of exhaustion and reproach. But Lettuce wasn't just a dog to me. He was my best friend, the one who had been with me through my worst moments. There was something in his eyes that made me feel an indescribable guilt, as if I was slowly abandoning him. I tried to spend more time with him, but it was difficult with all the responsibilities we now had with the baby. And the worst part was that my wife seemed to resent every minute I dedicated to Lettuce. The arguments started again, this time more frequent and with less patience. She accused me of not being present enough, of still putting Lettuce above our new family. I tried to explain that it wasn't about choosing one over the other, but she wouldn't listen. And the more I tried to defend my position, the further away she seemed to drift. One particularly difficult night, after one of our fights, I decided to take Lettuce for a walk to clear my mind. It was a long walk, longer than usual, but I needed to get out of the house to breathe some fresh air. As we walked through the nearby park, Lettuce suddenly stopped, ears perked up, body tense. I didn't know what he had seen or heard, but his reaction put me on alert. Then a dull noise echoed in the distance, followed by a muffled scream. My first instinct was to ignore it. It was probably just a fight between neighbors or some wild animal rummaging through the trash. But Lettuce wouldn't move, frozen in place, staring in the direction of the sound. I tugged on the leash to keep walking, but he wouldn't budge. "What is it, buddy?" I whispered, feeling a chill run down my spine. Then I heard it again, a weak sound, almost a sob. I wasn't sure what to do, but something inside me told me I had to check it out. I let Lettuce guide me, and after a few minutes, we arrived at a dimly lit alley between two buildings. There, curled up on the ground, was a woman, her face covered in tears, hands trembling. I approached cautiously. "Are you okay?" I asked, but she didn't respond immediately. Only when Lettuce moved closer, sniffing her gently, did she react. She looked at us with panic-filled eyes and mumbled something I couldn't understand. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice shaking. I froze. "I'm not going to hurt you," I assured her. "I just want to help." Slowly, the woman seemed to calm down. She told me she had been running from someone, that she had spent days without a safe place to stay. She didn't give me many details, but her fear was real. My first reaction was to call the police, but she begged me not to. "If they find me, if they know I spoke to someone." Her voice broke before she could finish. I felt a knot in my stomach. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave her there, but taking her home wasn't an option either. My wife was already at her limit with Lettuce's presence. This would only make things worse. But I also couldn't ignore the situation. After thinking for a moment, I offered her money to find a place to stay for the night, but she shook her head. "I don't need money, just a little time. A place where I can rest for a few hours without being afraid," she said, her eyes pleading. I looked at Lettuce, who remained sitting beside her, as if he understood everything that was happening. I let out a deep sigh. I knew this could complicate everything, but I couldn't turn my back on someone who truly needed help. Finally, I made a decision. "Come with me," I said. "I have a garage at home. It's not much, but at least you'll be safe for tonight." The woman hesitated, but eventually nodded. We walked back in silence, with Lettuce leading the way like a guardian. When we arrived, I helped her settle into the garage, making sure she was comfortable. "Just for tonight," I warned. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." I stood staring at the closed garage door for a long time before going inside the house. I knew this was just the beginning of something bigger, something I couldn't fully understand yet. And as I climbed into bed next to my wife, without telling her anything about what had happened, I felt the distance between us grow even larger. Because now, besides Lettuce, there was another secret between us, and I wasn't sure how I was going to handle it. The next morning began with the babies crying as usual. I got up heavily, my mind still trapped in the confusion of the previous night. The presence of the woman in the garage was a secret that weighed on my chest. I glanced at my wife, who was sleeping deeply after yet another sleepless night. Lettuce was curled up in the corner of the room, his eyes attentively following my every movement. I headed to the garage quietly, making sure no one saw me. When I opened the door, I found the woman sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked like she had barely slept, if at all. She looked at me cautiously, as if she still didn't know whether to trust me. "Thank you for letting me stay," she whispered. I nodded. "Do you have a plan? You can't stay here forever." She lowered her gaze. "I know, but I need to figure out my next steps. I don't want them to find me." Her fear was real. I could feel it in every word she spoke. I sat in front of her, and without knowing exactly why, I said, "Maybe I can help you." The conversation didn't last long. She told me she had been running from someone, but didn't want to give me details. From what little I could gather, she was escaping a dangerous situation and had nowhere to go. I found myself at a crossroads. I couldn't just abandon her, but I also couldn't risk my wife discovering what I was doing. There was already enough tension between us. Throughout the day, I tried to act normal. My wife noticed I was more distracted than usual, but didn't say anything. However, the unease inside me kept growing. Every time I passed near the garage, my heart raced, fearing that something had changed, that she was no longer there, or that someone had found her. In the afternoon, I took Lettuce for a walk to clear my mind. We walked through the park, the same place where I had found her. My thoughts raced with all the possibilities. What would I do if someone came looking for her? What would happen if my wife found out the truth? Lettuce, as always, seemed to read my thoughts. He stopped, looking at me with that calm expression that always made me feel like everything would be okay. But this time, I wasn't so sure it would be. When we returned home, my wife was busy with the baby. I approached to help her, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. But the distance between us was undeniable. We barely spoke beyond what was necessary. She still saw Lettuce as an obstacle, and now I had another secret between us. That night, while she slept, I returned to the garage. The woman was still awake, staring at a fixed point on the wall. She seemed lost in thought. "I can't stay any longer," she suddenly said. "I'm going to find another place." Her determination surprised me, but it also worried me. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet, but I don't want to cause you problems. You've already done too much." I sighed. I knew she was right, but the thought of leaving her alone without a plan felt cruel. "Let me help you find a safe place. You don't have to do this alone." For a moment, she seemed to consider my offer, but before she could answer, we heard a noise outside. Someone was approaching the house. My muscles tensed. Lettuce, who was with me, sensed it too. He immediately got up, alert. I looked at the woman, whose eyes were filled with fear. Without thinking twice, I turned off the light and gestured for her to stay silent. Lettuce pressed close to me, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. A shadow moved past the garage, and I held my breath. We waited in complete silence. The seconds stretched into what felt like eternal minutes. Finally, the figure disappeared. I couldn't be sure who it was, but my instincts told me this wasn't a coincidence. "You can't stay here any longer," I told her urgently. "It's dangerous." She nodded, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "You're right. But what do I do now?" I had no answer for that. All I knew was that time was running out, and that every decision we made from this moment on would change our lives forever. The tension in the garage was unbearable. The shadow that had passed in front of the house made it clear that the woman wasn't just being paranoid. Someone was looking for her. Lettuce remained on high alert, his breathing heavy, ears perked up. The woman trembled slightly, but her gaze reflected more determination than fear. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. She nodded, but the question remained. Where? I couldn't just leave her anywhere. She needed a safe place where no one could find her. "I know someone," she finally said. "A shelter where they might help me, but they'll need you to take me there." I had no choice. If I left her here, she was in danger. If I turned her over to the police, I had no idea what story they would tell about her. My wife still knew nothing, and I couldn't risk involving her any further. That same night, I prepared what was needed. I gave her a backpack with clothes I no longer used and some food. We made sure no one was following us. Lettuce wanted to come with us, but this time I couldn't risk it. I knelt and looked into his eyes. "Stay here, buddy. I'll see you soon." Lettuce seemed to understand. He wagged his tail softly and lay back down. We left cautiously. I drove for hours, heading outside the city, following the woman's directions. Finally, we arrived at a small shelter, a discreet house with dim lights. An older man opened the door. His eyes showed understanding and a hint of exhaustion. "Can you be trusted?" he asked, looking at me seriously. "I just want her to be safe." The man nodded and let her in. She turned to me, her expression a mix of gratitude and guilt. "Thank you for everything. I won't forget what you did." I looked at her one last time before leaving. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't want to know. As I drove back home, the weight on my chest began to lift, but the uncertainty remained. When I arrived, the house was completely silent. I walked over to the couch where Lettuce was sleeping soundly. I sat beside him, running my fingers through his fur. At least he was still here. The next morning, my wife looked at me with distrust. She knew something was going on, but didn't ask. Instead, she spoke with a coldness that hurt more than any argument. "I think we need some time apart. This isn't working." My world shook. I knew we had been distant, but I never imagined it would come to this. I looked at Lettuce, then at my wife, and finally at the baby, asleep in his crib. "I don't want to lose you," I whispered. "Neither do I, but we can't keep going like this. You don't trust me, and I feel like we're growing further apart every day." I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, yes, there were secrets between us. I couldn't deny that my love for Lettuce had been a point of tension, but this was bigger than that. That same afternoon, I packed my bags. I decided to leave for a while, to give her space. I took Lettuce with me. I didn't know what would come next, but something inside me told me I needed to find myself before I could try to repair what was left of my family. As I drove away from the house I once called home, Lettuce stuck his head out the window, enjoying the fresh air. I looked at him and smiled sadly. He was still my companion, no matter what. And for the first time in a long time, I accepted that some endings aren't happy, but they are necessary.